Hello and welcome to the last fall Artist Focus with Catherine Schwalbe. My name is Corinne Little and I'm the organizer Out of Sight. Out of Sight is an organization
I'm sorry, it looks like Karen has frozen, and I hope she comes back. Miss Karen. Oh dear. She might need to loop back in, and so I will hang tight, and I'm hanging tight with you all. Okay. So she's got to dial back in. Sorry, people. Awfully glad you're here and hope you're coffeeed up.
Hello, we're having a little technical hitch today, but hopefully we'll be able to run smoothly from now on. Otherwise, I'll have to connect the Zoom to the Twitch, but we'll keep you posted.
I was tapping, everybody got something, so.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Yes, Out of Sight is situated on the lands of the Council of Three Fires, the Adwa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi nations. Out of Sight as an organization is particularly interested in having conversations about that which is invisible, that we don't normally like to talk about or discuss. But we do that, really focusing on artists' work and their practice and what they're thinking about. Today, I am in conversation with the Chicago-based artist, Catherine Schwalbe. Schwalbe was born and raised in Wisconsin in a 130-year-old stone house. Schwalbe came from a family of 9 children, most comfortable using their hands, and is a Chicago resident for nearly 40 years. Schwalbe completed her BFA with a sculpture concentration at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee in 1983 and took additional classes at the Artist Bookworks, Columbia College for book and paper arts. I was a TA there in the late 90s. And Lillstreet Art Center and Chicago Industrial Arts and Design Center.
Yeah.
Schwalbe's capability to work part-time as a recreation therapist and consultant in 1998, following graduate coursework in a recreation therapy, aided in her ability to create a more solid art practice. As with many, Schwalbe will be shifting her life and reorganizing priorities in a post-pandemic world and putting both feet into her art practice. Catherine is a maker of objects and creator of experiences that may include mixed media, sculpture, found objects, bronze and iron, installation and site-specific works, all centered around issues and aesthetics related to food systems, water, agriculture, and being human. Catherine has haptic studios for a more mixed media works and has been a long-time member of Lillstreet Studios at the Lillstreet Art Center in Chicago. though she believes art happens where the artist is. She teaches a class in the summer at Lillstreet called The Food of Art, or The Art of Food. They're all interconnected.
Yes.
And the class evolves every year based on a theme related to food, art, and connection. Catherine Schwalbe's social practice works have been born out of the need and comfort with engaging with people, and understanding now as an overlap with her recreation therapy practice. So welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you here today.
Awesome.
And Catherine was part of our Out of Sight, was curated into the Out of Sight program this summer that we did in the fall parks. And so we'll be showing a snippet of that in a moment. Would you like to introduce the first video, or shall I jump straight in it?
Which one's the first one?
The soil.
I will talk about that briefly. I was a visiting artist in Ogle County for 8 or 9 years and developed relationships with many of the farmers there. And one of the farmers I stayed with, Ned Bushnell, took me out to the field and taught me about his soil and how he amends the soil and protects the soil, because without soil, we don't have food. And it inspired a piece the following year, which you'll see in a little bit. It's called the Oregon Tilth Project, and otherwise known as a soil smackdown. And I collected soils with 9 different farmers and made stoneware jars with soil imagery. And we had out in a tented area in a park, lined up the soils, and the farmers had to find their soil. And so here we go with a short clip of the the Great Soil Smackdown of, I believe it was 2009.
Hey, how are you?
Just moving fine.
Would you pick yourself?
You know, this group more, it counts for more than what we started with. So you having a good time?
Yeah, I'm having a great time.
No, you're not. Let's go.
Oh, that makes me smile seeing those folks.
Yes, yes.
And half of that group were the visiting artists, and half the group were the farmers, and it was they trusted me to do this thing, and they tittered about it all week. One of the farmers put some in a little hanging jar on her necklace and went to her grandson's Little League game that morning, and she's smelling her soil in order to go to the event in the afternoon to make sure she could figure out her soil. And so everyone
So do you want to explain what a smackdown is? Because maybe not all of our audience would know what that is.
Sure. I mean, I call it a smackdown just because you saw the enthusiasm. And people were literally smacking each other's hands because some people claimed a jar of their soil, and others were convinced it was theirs and would slap the hand of the person who claimed that soil. But it was just a sort of a contest about how people may or may not be connected to the land around them, and looking at equipment versus getting down there in the soil on your knees and really evaluating it. I mean, before a lot of the chemicals have been used, I understand farmers would literally taste the soil to know what their soil needed. And the soil is the patient of the farm, and you need to know what your patient needs. And so the soil smackdown is sort of just a sassy name for this game. I guess you could call it a game.
So you created a kind of a contest with, I think, was it like 10 farmers?
Yeah. Yeah.
And each farmer had to guess their own soil. And only 4 out of the 10 could actually distinguish what their soil, which soil was theirs.
Yes.
And that was like the part of the process.
And the other 6 are still mad at me. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Oh dear, oh dear. But it generated, you know, these conversations in the community, which is what we want, you know. So I'm just going to share the second piece, which is called Before and After, which is a piece. Oops. This piece was created by Catherine Schwalbe this summer for Out of Sight, but I think you've also been doing lots of these in different parts of the city. And probably have some coming up, maybe near you. So we'll let you know about those at the end of the program as well. So Before and After by Catherine Schwalbe.
Today we are at Jackson Park near the Osaka Garden at 2 locations, both here and near the Museum of Science and Industry. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral homelands of the Council of 3 Fires, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi peoples. Today, along with the performances, we will be able to view a sculpture by Yoko Ono called Sky Landing. Helen Lee's work will be performed in and around this sculpture. You will also be seeing work by DeMarcus Purnam, Wanapa Pintong Eubanks, and Cathy Schwalbe. I'd like to thank the Chicago Park District for their support on this project, as well as the jury panel, Martine Vial, Ika Trinks, and Jeremy Pauley, and a special thanks to Corin Little for all of her hard work behind the scenes. She's truly the engine carrying this project forward, and thanks to you, our audience. So I hope you enjoy the show.
I just treated myself to something I hope existed, and I found it so easily with extra long needles. Do you know you can get a needle that's 12 inches long?
Yes.
I got a set.
Upholstery, right?
Like, yes. I got 5, 6, and 8 inches, I think, on it.
All my pins are lined up already. Perfect. I'm glad they're in little lines. Before and after. So do you need, I've got scissors and tea. And do you want me to start on your coat? Oh my God. Okay, wait a minute. I have the right patch for that. Seriously, how am I going to do that? I have a patch for that, but I was going to, what do I do with all this layers? Like a bowl or whatever, maybe that. No! Okay. I don't have that. No, but I have I mean, this is a nice linen. Help me! Okay. We're gonna bump up that jacket. I think we're gonna use this nice linen, right? What do you think for your cups? Okay. Thrilled about that. And Garfield's a little closer for you. A little closer. I came all the way from Little Village. That's a trip. Yeah, it's a nice bike ride. Yeah.
Oh, you bike?
You think she'd have a little bit left on the longer. No. To work through.
I feel you. Especially after this past year and a half.
But you are ready to be bending yourself.
I have to
So
perform
exciting.
again, but I was constantly
Absolutely. So you took the years off, you did.
I did.
So what I'm going to do for that, I'm going to plug in my machine. And I think we're going to put a patch in the back and I'll go back and forth and go
So that's just like
That's
a dream
something
come true.
because you're pulling on
Yeah, I got these from the thrift store and I've had them for like, I don't even know how many years. Maybe if we just get more flat.
Oh yeah, here we go.
Just add in a tie. It's called a pod. Ready? Are you ready?
Yes! Look at this thing.
You have these are always amazing, like,
Exactly.
now. Totally thrilled. So now, there you go. I mean, it's cut and not, or put whatever thing is in. I've never even heard maybe like you have anything that needs like a waistband. That's the last day.
And yeah, so I would leave like 5 inches or so on both sides.
Right, yeah. And maybe even with a lighter, you burn the end or something so it doesn't fray anymore. Because it kind of has that plastic. And it's gonna then you say then,
Lola, no more crying like you do.
yay! And you can hardly even tell.
That's awesome.
This is
No, and
perfect.
it doesn't look like it looks like it's intentional.
Yeah.
And give yourself some length, honey. Give yourself maybe, I don't know. That's good. Yeah.
It's a great skirt too. I love
The little thing.
I know it's like a hiking skirt.
Yeah.
Like very old. Doesn't fit.
I love those two, stitching the soil and stitching and mending people's clothes. There's a real, symmetry between those pieces.
You brought that out in me, so thank you.
Well, I think this idea of I've really been thinking about, and thinking about your work, thinking about this idea of how sewing is so interconnected with this concept of mending, and how that is such an important, it's just what drives your work, and everything you're doing, special, as a social practice practitioner. But I want to start with asking you about how you think about where you situate your practice, because sometimes you're working in the rural communities, sometimes you're working in diverse communities across the Chicago landscape and the greater, there's the greater Chicago. So I know that the first piece was you mentioned part of a 9-year residency you had in one of the counties. Can you talk about why you were so drawn to that community?
Well, I think it comes from a personal need to balance the urban life and urban experience to rural life and open skies. And my background, I grew up north of Milwaukee in a town called Cedarburg, and we lived in the rural part of that town and walked up the hill for our milk at 50 cents a gallon, and would walk home sometimes with a warm gallon of milk. And it was, I think, a yearning for that type of life, but knowing that I don't want all of one or the other. And so the residencies were fantastic. The visiting artist experiences were a nice compromise. And I feel that it's almost bicultural in a way to be able to negotiate both worlds and to keep conversation open between urban and rural life. And the Worm Farm has supported my work up in Wisconsin so much over the years, and they call it the urban and rural flow, and the importance of keeping dialogue and understanding open against all odds. It feels like there are more and more barriers to both communities, and I try to keep building bridges more than walls in terms of both environments.
Yeah, and I think there is, when we talk about, there's obviously, well, I've seen through your work and what you've been doing over the years that there is, real vibrancy to the culture that is happening, in places, in rural Wisconsin and rural Illinois. But there is, having sat on the jury committee for the Illinois Arts Council, I am aware of how limited the resources are in terms of how do we reach out, and the importance of creating a balance, between cultural investment in the rural communities. And I'm intrigued to know, because I mean that the soil smackdown, as you call, in the that we showed as the first video. What were the conversations that happened in the aftermath of that work?
I do wonder. What I was thrilled about a couple of years going was people would walk up to me and they would say, "And what are you doing this year?" It created an anticipation of what Kathy was going to pull out of her hat this year, and so that was really fun to create a sense of anticipation. And I'd like to think that occasionally it's mentioned post event, right? I don't know what sort of impact any of my work made there. Every year I did a variety of things, some social practice, some honestly just sometimes working in the tool shed. Sometimes a farmer would give me a picnic table and I would make work and objects related to my time there. And sometimes it was participatory. And that was one of the highlights, was the soil smackdown, certainly.
And
Go ahead.
how do you go about developing a participatory work? Are you somebody that embeds yourself in the village or in the city first, or how do you go about that?
Really, really good question. With that piece, I'm not sure they would have participated in it if they hadn't known me. I don't think I could have gone in there my first year and created such a thing. At least I would not feel comfortable creating such a thing without knowing the people. And that was probably 5 or 6 years into it. And there was a relative consistency with the farming hosts. And so when I went that year, when I would apply, because every year you still needed to apply, I would describe what I wanted to be doing. So there was some sort of precedence, and I would guess some sort of buzz prior to my physically showing up. So some events are like that, developing relationships longitudinally, and some are more, much more extemporaneous, outside of white walls and engaging people on the street, much like I did with Out of Sight this summer. Those events were definitely, some people intentionally came because they knew about it, and passersby were curious and would come by. And I've done it several times since then. And the folks that are walking by are curious. Some just keep walking and don't want to engage at all, and that's all right too. I just want to see if there's a pulse out there. And then some people intentionally show up for the event. So it's sort of a combination. If I've announced it on social media, there's a few folks that will come that know about it, and then there are the casual passersby. And some people have brought back work. Oh, I'm here till 4 o'clock, and they live half a block away, and I had a woman bring back an item to come and mend together. When I was down in Pullman a week or so ago, a woman I met on the sidewalk after the first day was a few doors down from J.B. Daniels' Mosnart space, the artist residency space. And the woman came back the following day and she said, I've been dreading my mending pile for a couple of years. And last night you switched my brain, and I was so looking forward to coming today and mending with people. And you know, I totally teared up. Like, that's what it's about, was that moment. And so she stayed about 4 hours mending with us.
That's great.
It was really lovely.
Yes, and it's the conversations, you know, I just, you know, there were a few conversations that we shared in the video, but it is the conversations that happen in the sewing circles, you know, that are always so precious,
Yes.
you know, and that's also part of it. And, you know, can you talk about what inspired this at this particular moment? You know,
Sure.
it's called Before and After.
I've been doing mending groups since the 80s as a recreation therapist in long-term care, and I never called it art. But as you said, it's amazing what comes out when people's hands are busy. And I would host reminiscence groups, and it would be really hard getting information out of people or feelings and thoughts. But if I had something for them to do, there was a lot more engagement. And so I started mending, and started mending with them because I saw torn clothes and buttons and piles of clothes. And so we just started mending together. And I would thread the needles in advance, and people would wheel into the group and just start in mending whatever was in front of them. It was magical. And so it comes out of that, and a couple of other, Nancy Clem, who was on one of the early, the part of the early Before and After, she had invited me to her home probably 15 years ago as to mend together. And I wasn't able to make it, but I just sort of stored that idea in my head as something. And then as I understood some of my work being called social practice, I just made work and I didn't care what it was called. And someone said, well, you know, you're doing social practice. I'm like, well, what's that? And it was just something I knew I had to do as a creative person. And so back to your question about the before and after, it is centered around our experience, our global experience through this pandemic that we're not really completely through yet. And if we don't shape up, we're going to be having waves of variations for who knows how long to come. And so it's really before and not quite after is kind of what it should be called. And sort of what was our life before, and how are we going to rearrange our life going forward for more off-screen engagement. And I realize I'm talking on a screen now, and there are viewers on this darn screen, and I'm just going to root for everybody to be in the same room and fight the good fight.
Yes, we have to take the risk, you know, and yes, I'm wondering, I'm intrigued to know, and obviously some of this is confidential, but how have the conversations with the general public, how have they, has there been any specific nuggets of wisdom or any stories about that with people that you might be able to share that is really kind of a revelation for you in this time?
I can't think of any sort of general public stories. A woman joined us and brought part of her I'm sorry, part of her son who is deceased, brought part of his sweatshirt to sew on the inside of her winter jacket. And she spent 2 days with
Gosh.
us and literally beautifully cut it up and created a yoke on the inside. And the jacket lining was torn in 3 places, and she mended that part first and then put her pieces of her son's the hoodie sweatshirt that she always saw him in. And how do you even put words to that? And she didn't put words to it a whole lot. She sewed for 2 days and was present and part of the conversation, and it was just really, and for her to do that at home alone, a whole different experience, right? And to create
Yes.
a space of people stitching and honoring that and honoring each other in such a gesture for her.
Yes, yes. And that's when, it really becomes rooted in this mending process. And, we have been through such a turbulent year in the States.
Yes.
With the news stories, the politics, the murders, and it's been physically traumatizing. How do I know, and work like this that is going into diverse communities, it naturally brings people together.
Yeah.
And that's what art and culture does.
Yes.
And we learn so much when we cross those boundaries. And I think that's, another important aspect of what you're doing, with your practice. And, I see, I was thinking before, and I talked at the beginning about how, sewing as a practice, whether it's with the soil or whether it's with people, is so much about this process of imagining, when we're creating clothes, or creating or building buildings, you still use the same 3D like visualization process. And so, this idea of imagining or mending, is so integral to your practice. How are you thinking about this as a process of social practice? And maybe, what do you think is needed by social practice practitioners right now in America? How would you reimagine that at this time?
I think it's more important than ever that we create a place for people to gather in a safe manner, period. And it seems like I personally, I can really only speak for me. I still am leery of being inside places. And so I feel like taking it to the streets is so lovely anyway. And being outside is what I yearn to do in the summertime during the growing season of the upper Midwest. And so it's been a pleasure for me to do these things outside and with Out of Sight and with Pullman. And I've got one more event, and I hope the weather holds out in November for one more on Armitage Avenue. But I'm also looking at a group at my church to mend some of the vestments for the pastor. There are buttons missing and rips and things. And so my church will gather in an outdoor space. And so it is, it seems like a a need for people to be together. It's a need for me to be with other people. I live alone, and this is part of my own gut need to engage with people. And I think about the populations and the humans that need repair, and the root word of reparations is repair. And I've created sort of an edition of 10 mending boxes, and in the mending box, it's half art, half function. And so one of the things in the mending box is this strand of threads in varying skin tones, and with the definition of what reparations is as a root word, or as repair as a root word of reparations. And that's a societal mend that is so necessary. That is, it's one of the great challenges of our time. And if not now, when? And so that is, if we look at mending our clothing is one thing. The average clothing item is worn 5 to 7 times. And I do think how we're treating the earth is how we're treating each other. And it's connected to me. And that's why the soil, and that's why the engagement, it is the same thing to me. There's no difference. And I don't even know if I answered your question.
Yes, no, that was I think, this idea of, I've been fascinated, as I've been traveling around, I've been living with different friends, who I've known over the years. And, it's really interesting how people throw away their trash and what they throw away, and how different, and that is cultural. I have a friend who I went to college with who's been living in Germany. So the way in which he organizes his trash to be is so I was like really quite interested, And my mum in Scotland has 5 large bins, and they take up about 10 meters in the garden, and so it's really interesting how people are thinking of what we throw away and what we repurpose, what we reuse. And I think what I love about the before and after project is that it is about this idea of upcycling. It is about this idea of reuse, which I think is so vital. And I'm just appalled at that statement. I can't believe it, that's crazy. But I wonder how, and I think you're starting to talk about it there, is this, if we are to think about sustainability, it takes care. It is this, and we have so much, I think city people have so much to learn from the rural community. It is these slow processes that, we really need to be more observant of. And I think your work really draws attention to the slow and to the detail. But I was wondering how you think about sustainability or sustainable practices, because you've been working for many decades. You graduated in 1983. And can you talk about why it is so, how you, You know, when I think about your work, I always think about the environment, you know, and that wonderful piece you did when you cut the word truth out of the grass in a field. You know, how, how are you thinking about sustainability as part of the process of making work?
I have a fair amount of guilt working with clay and burning fossil fuels. And I think part of what I do is counterbalance that. When we're firing a gas kiln for 12 hours up to 2,300 degrees, where does that gas come from? And when you break down even glaze content and where are all those pigments and 50-pound bags of clay getting trucked into urban areas, and what is the carbon footprint of an urban person who works with clay? And so it's not necessarily sustainable. I know there's a former instructor I have that lives in Saskatchewan, and he has really unpacked that carbon footprint and has a bicycle powered kiln, which I think is pretty darn cool. And I don't know how sustainable even such a thing like that is. I mean, part of this process with the mending is also getting rid of things that I've collected, and for what's called, what a good friend calls FAPs, future art projects. And so in these gatherings, people are bringing me their stuff, and I'm like, no, please, thank you, but this is about me also getting rid of things and not buying, but using things in a practical way. And so I think site-specific sculpture has its place. Social practice is absolutely sustainable to me from where I sit. It isn't about making things. It's about humans being human and engaging humans. And not that public art can't do that also, because we certainly see connection through connection and disconnection, shall we say, with some things that should never have been public art, but that's a whole nother conversation. But if you look at engaging people in urban and rural spaces, I think that's some sustainable, beautiful stuff, and huge potential.
Yes, and I want to invite the audience. We have a lovely, warm audience in the room with us all today.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for joining us all. So if you have any questions for Kathy, please pop them in the chat. And Dimple B. Shaw, tuning in from Bangalore, India, has actually shared a point about the same question she has when she does printing. In terms, we use so many paper for proof printing, and again, this is, trees, but also different types of printing actually uses a lot of chemicals that goes into the water. And as we know, the water goes into our soil, that goes into our food. And this is part of the circular system that we are contributing to as artists. So I think a lot of your practice, you're actually you're often thinking about this circular system of creativity. And can you maybe share a story or a thought you had about or because you've done so many pieces. I'm thinking actually about the piece in the bed. That was a circular system.
Which one? I'm sorry.
The one with in the bed with the person moving every 2 hours.
Oh my goodness, yeah. So wow. Corin had me really dig into old works, and after art school, there was a pretty long hiatus before I could really make psychic and physical time for making work. But in that interim, a good friend had organized a women's history event in March, and this was, I believe, in the mid 90s, maybe early 90s. Jennifer Dotson, and it was at the Chicago Historical Society, and I have spent 42 years in long-term care, and some of my work has referenced the feminization of aging that many long-term care communities, especially at that time, were mostly women. And it is that gap is closing because of women working more and having similar stresses as male counterparts. So that gap of male-female balance is closing in, but it was primarily women in the early 80s. And a nursing home lent me a bed, and I rolled it into my minivan along with a bedside table and a lamp and an old medical chart, those types that are on springs. And a good friend from college donned an outfit I made out of women's hankies to symbolize the feminine part of aging. And if someone isn't able to move on their own in bed, they are turned every 2 hours to another part of their body to prevent bed sores. And I had Vicky in the bed in the outfit for 2 full days. And I had hired a nurse's aide that I just dearly loved, and she had a presence in a room. And she canceled on me at the last minute, kind of chickened out to move my friend every 2 hours. But the piece was called Every 2 Hours. And, I would like to do that piece again and genuinely have a person there. The nurses' aides are literally the backbone of every long-term care community. And I think about that artist in New York that shook the hands of the sanitation workers.
Yes.
I think about shaking the hands of every nurse's aide in the city of Chicago, because if the pandemic hasn't shown us who is the most desperately needed and the most vulnerable, next to the older adult, it is the nurse's aide, the superheroes, the unseen superheroes.
Yeah.
So that's what that is. Thanks for asking about a piece from 3 lifetimes ago.
Yes, and I think this this kind of the care that is needed for the elderly, for the soil, for our city right now, all of these things are integral, and are such, and are at the heart of your work and your practice. And I think, I'm really, in the Out of Sight community, we've been having conversations about, how we work as an organization, to be sustainable, and when we're organizing, we've always funded one international artist to visit Chicago every year as part of the program. But how do we think about reducing our carbon imprint? How do, I mean, always are thinking sustainably, but I think, this is one of the urgent lenses that we all need to be adopting
Yes.
in terms of how we move forward. And yes, so I want to kind of, if are there any questions from the audience or thoughts from the audience about that? But I want to think, when you're thinking about, this process of slowness, and I used the term a few years ago, ecologies of care, and thinking about ecology as a circular system. And actually, Jeremy Powley, when we were curating the public performances this summer in Chicago, that was the conversation of the curatorial committee was thinking about circles, and wanting to create a circular system through Chicago as we produce the work. And to me, this idea of circular also relates to practice and process, and thinking about the artwork, thinking about the process of making art. Can you talk about how you are, because you talked about moving from the studio into social practice, and how this operates, and how this is like rehealing for you,
I have the I have the privilege of sort of doing what I want. And that's big, and it's a burden, and it's an incredibly freeing thing. And so people have walked into my clay studio. Right now I share it with a friend. But prior to that, people would walk in and they would look around and they say, well, who made all of this? Because I think to some people it didn't make it, I don't know if they thought it was a variety of artists showing work, but I only had my work in that space. And when they discovered it was just one person, I don't know, it's just kind of funny to me. So I feel sometimes, and when you have looked deeply, you yourself, Corin, at my work, it's a bit overwhelming on my side to have someone really look at it and really dig deep and ask questions that I haven't really thought about. But when I just sort of make work that I know I have to make. And I don't know, from the viewer's point of view, it seems like people really like consistency and really like an artist to do kind of one thing for a long time. I get bored silly doing. I like to make things. I like to sew. I like to do, and so I kind of do what I like. And
yes, but there is a consistency in how you're thinking and the processes in which you're using to make. And I think what I was getting at was this relationship between producing social practice work, because that is, really, takes a lot of energy.
Yes.
And I know from myself, from my own practice, that I do these big, ensemble projects, or I work with, lots of people. I do the civic engagement, but then I like to go and work in my studio, and it's nourishing.
Yes.
And it's the time I need, that alone time. And then that builds the ideas for the next project. And also I'm processing the stuff from So there's, again, it's about this kind of balance, and this idea of nurturing yourself in order to produce the next project. And again,
I really love January and February.
Me too.
I
Me
really
too.
love hiding and making and sometimes reflecting. I want to go back real briefly to the piece about the person in the bed. When I am on a farm, I look for relationships and correlations. And I was on a hog farm, and they had the crates for the sows, where they gave birth to the babies, and they're in crates so the babies don't get stepped on and killed. And that's sort of the premise of why confinement operations have the sows in crates where they literally can't turn around. Well, some of those sows have wounds from not being able to move. And so I think about institutional care for elders and large farming practices, and they are dehumanizing. It feels dehumanizing. And I know that that's like a great big bomb, but I just wanted to get that out there because, I mean, that piece I did back in, that was a 20-some-year-old piece about long-term care. And then to have visited the hog farm 15, 20 years later and witnessing that, it was just one of those things. And I think farmers, there's some relationships with artists. They like to work alone. We like to work alone. I think Chuck Close said, I became an artist because I like to work alone, and I totally get that. I think we're always torn, like you said, between really wanting to be out there and then who's texting me now or whatever it might be, like, this is my day. So
yes, there's people in the audience who would appreciate that comment. And Wanapa has a comment. She said, I got Kathy and her sewing gadgets are so cool and precious. And she has a huge needle behind her with that's threaded with the eco thread. I love that you use materials with environmental consciousness. You inspire me to start to put more thought and effort in to find materials props that are good for our environment.
Nice.
And that, thank you, Wanapa. I think that's a really great place for us to end today because, I think this idea of reusing and recycling or, choosing to thrift shop rather than buy new is, something as we go into this international conference that it starts on Monday. It's really thinking about, these that is talking about climate change and the urgent necessity that we need to make now. And we have 4 years to make these decisions so that we reduce the heating of the planet. So, and I think that goes back to, this idea of, we've been through the pandemic, we're still living through it. But I think a lot of people, it has been a dehumanizing year and a half. And how can we collectively think about systems of care as we move forward?
What makes us human? Yeah.
Yes. So many thanks, Kathy, for being our last full artist focus. We will be back in the spring in February with a new 8-week series where we'll be interviewing one artist every week as part of the Artist Focus series that we do. And all of the interviews, all of the conversations that we've had will be archived on the Artist Focus page on the Out of Sight website. So do check that out. And here is also, again, the link to Cathy Schwalbe's bio. And Cathy, you mentioned that you have an upcoming thing happening in November on Armitage Avenue. Can you tell where, do you know what date and time that is so we can share that with people?
We're going to be mending on Armitage Avenue on November 14th, 1 to 4 p.m. Weather permitting. If it's really, really cold, we might go inside and keep the room well ventilated. But if it's decent enough, we're going to be outside on the sidewalk like we were a month or two ago. And so that will conclude this mending season. And there might even be champagne at that one.
Well, thank you so much, Cathy. It's always a great pleasure to be with you, and I really hope to make that mending session. I actually have a little bit in this jumper that needs, every time I put it on, I think of you. So
fantastic.
Looking forward to that. And yes, just we talked about ecology and sustainable practices. When we were talking about Cathy's work, we were talking about circular systems of care and thinking about how we can think about really reimagine new models. So we are not creating dehumanized processes, and how, how Cathy's social practice is really thinking about these circular systems of care when she's working in both the rural and in the city and neighborhoods. So thank you so much for joining us all today, and hope you have a lovely hibernating winter. Okay, much love to everybody. Bye-bye.
So much.
Bye-bye.